my alley. This is right up my alley. This one.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna get started. My name is Christine Woody, and I am a staff person here at Empower Missouri. And I am moderating the Justice is Blind, panel. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming. Two came from quite a distance to join us today. Don lives in Columbia, so it's not too out of the way.
I just got up.
Hop on over, right?
You didn't have to fight.
If I can find the right one. I open that would be even better. Oh, goodness gracious.
You want it out of the program?
Yeah, I just because I can't find the actual one.
Get my glasses on.
I feel like I'm prepared and I don't have them. I'm sorry.
We decided who our actual moderator would be today. Did you?
I was, yeah.
Change our mind.
All right. Our first panelist is Chief Chris Connelly. He is St. Joseph's Chief of Police. He's been that since January of 2006. After being honorably discharged from the United States Navy, he began his police career in 1984 with the Norfolk Ports and Industrial Authority Police. In 1986, he went to work for the city of Portsmouth as retiring Assistant Chief of Police from that department in December of 2005. He is a graduate of the 185th session of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and the Professional Executive Leadership School at the University of Richmond. He has his master's in public administration from Troy State University, a BA in criminology from St. Leo College, and an AAS from Tidewater Community College, where he later spent 5 years as an adjunct faculty member. He is currently term on the Police Administration Committee for the International Association of the Chief of Police. Welcome to him. Next, we have Michael Voss. He is one of the co-founders and currently a managing attorney for the ArchCity Defenders. ArchCity Defenders is a nonprofit law firm dedicated to providing the best possible holistic legal counsel to the homeless and the working poor, as well as providing services aimed to remedy and mitigate any client's housing issues, mental health, substance abuse, other disabilities or disorders. Our clients, otherwise the forgotten poor, do not qualify for the services of other organizations, are underserved by existing overwhelmed the public defender system, and are unable to afford private counsel. Mr. Voss has his law degree from St. Louis University. And finally, the creative bio from our beloved Don, currently serving as our chair for the Empower Missouri Human Rights Task Force. He is a retired high school math teacher and English teacher. He serves the assistant soccer coach at Lincoln University. He just directed the Jefferson City's YMCA youth sports. He now works as a carpenter and spends a lot of his time at his farm in rural Missouri, planting wonderful vegetables that he shares with all of us. So I want to thank each of you for being here, and I think Don's going to start us off, and then Michael John's going to follow up, and then we'll wrap up the presentation with 2 comments. Thank you.
Are you a soccer player, Michael John?
No, but my kids are.
Oh, there you go. Well, Chris saw in my biography that I had involvement in soccer, and he's a soccer player, so we have some continuity among the panelists here. I'm basically going to start off by going over what Empower Missouri has done on policing over the last 5 years, because that's a pretty convenient way to explain our involvement, the sort of experiences we have, the expertise we've developed, and the sort of conclusions we're working towards. When I first took on chairing the Human Rights Commission, a member of the board was a student in St. Louis. She was in a class that was required to submit a grant application. She did it and asked for money from the Spark Plug Foundation to pay for something related to human rights, and she got it. She got $5,000, and we hadn't been consulted. We didn't have any plans on what to spend it for, and she hadn't stipulated that in the application, but we kicked around some ideas and eventually settled on inviting David Harris, who's a professor at University of Pittsburgh Law School, who works on community police filing, that sort of thing. He occurs regularly on national news as a commentator on this stuff. And he agreed to come for basically his travel expenses, which we could afford. And we had him speak in St. Louis, Columbia, Jeff City, Springfield, and Kansas City. This was about 5 years ago. In each of those cities, we brought together a coalition of groups who were interested, including police chiefs from most of those places. And he delivered his insights on what was going on with racial profiling, and panelists, including the police chief or a representative of the police chief, then responded. And it really looked promising. That his point of view was that we know enough to achieve bias-free policing. It's just a matter of catching on about how to implement the things we know in law enforcement agencies. Sometimes it's do, sometimes particularly in big departments or departments that aren't well funded, it can be very difficult to do. But on the other hand, the fact that we do know some things that work opens the door to having significant success in the near future in terms of achieving fair and impartial policing, or at least making significant progress toward it. One of the things he told me, and I listened to all 5 presentations, and I drove in from Springfield to Kansas City, and we talked through that period. So I'm now an expert on the basis of that. The big expertise that he bequeathed on me was pointing out that consent searches were a good item of officer action to look at in the vehicle stop report. That a lot of things are hard to draw firm conclusions from because there are multiple factors involved in why an officer will do something. If an officer is black motorists for equipment defects, is that because the officer is targeting the black motorists, or is it because black drivers tend to be have lower incomes and drive older cars that need more repairs? So it's just a factor. It's not actually a racial bias. It's a bias of the system against low-income people, and you simply can't tell from the data. There's no way to sort that out. But if you look at things that officers do after a stop has been made, and they've been face-to-face with the driver, and they've identified what ethnicity they think that driver is a member of, and then you look at the things that involve the most officer discretion, you can get something where race is, if not the only factor involved, a big factor. Interrupt me anytime. We need to have some, and I'm simplifying somewhat. And he said consent searches are going to be good on this. Consent search occurs when an officer doesn't have probable cause, yet has suspicions about the driver. So if all other things being equal, an officer tends to, I would say, coerce minority drivers into consenting to searches more frequently than white drivers. That may not be actual, proof, but it comes pretty close, especially if it's a large enough disparity, and a lot of officers are doing it, and it's happening statewide in a lot of agencies. And especially when you're not demanding the sort of proof that would convict someone, but you're just trying to say, well, is bias a problem? Because if bias isn't a problem, you don't want to waste a whole lot of money on doing things that are going to fix a problem. But if it looks highly probable that bias, and particularly we're talking about implicit bias, not the sort of outright bigotry in which somebody said, yeah, I believe whites are superior. You're talking about things that are based on the common stereotypes that affect everybody because of the shared culture we have. And it's white people against other white people when they can see a difference, and it's black people against black people in some cases. So it's part of the cultural bias that's there. If you recognize it, then you can learn to avoid it. And we especially need officers to learn to avoid it because they are professionals who are commissioned to enforce the laws without bias. So if they have an implicit bias, they need to recognize they have it and then figure out ways that they will act independent of that bias when they're making decisions. So it turns out that generally across the state, there is a lot of bias involved in those consent searches, like 2.5 times. Blacks are affected by consent searches at a rate 2.5 times that of white drivers. Looking at all the data submitted to the Attorney General each year and compiled in the vehicle stop report. So part of what I want to do is to give you an introduction to what we've done with the vehicle stop report data. And there are 2 sheets out there, which I have now lost my sample copy of. One of them involves the looking at statewide data. There's thousands of stops by officers, and there are, I think there are 50 or so different officer actions that are compiled in here. When they make a stop, is it for equipment or is it for having an expired license, or is there a moving violation that occurred? And then after they made the stop, do they have a consent search, or do they have to make an arrest for some reason? So all that data is here. You can look through it, and on the second page of the printed version.
Christine, do you have any more of them?
No. These are available on the Empower Missouri website. You go to the Human Rights Task Force page, and down in the lower right corner, there's a collection of documents that are there. So you can do it and download it, or email me, and I will send it to you. Well, let's look at the resisting arrest first, and then we'll go back up to the consent searches. There are 4 officer actions that we put the consent searches, because that's there's no probable cause there. The officer is acting mostly on the suspicions that he or she has. We think investigative stops are interesting to look at. We think dog alerts are interesting because they're a lot like consent searches. If an officer doesn't have probable cause but suspects drugs enough to call a dog to come to a search, is the suspicion equal among white and minority drivers, or some of those groups singled out? And again, the drug dog searches tend to occur more frequently for black drivers. Resisting arrest is interesting because all officers are going to be going to encounter situations in which a driver is uncooperative. You can't tell for sure whether it could well be that black drivers have more of a tendency to be angry when stopped by police than white drivers. I think they're justified. But it could also be that officers are less able to de-escalate a situation when there's a cultural difference between the officer and the person stopped. So if there is no disparity in resisting arrest, it would indicate that, well, whatever's going on, the officer seems to be able to deal with the situation well. If there is a disparity, it may be because the black drivers are angry and you really can't tell. So it's a situation where a low disparity would indicate the officers are probably doing a good job, and it's open to discussion if there isn't. Part of our logic here is that this year, in looking at the data, we noticed that there were a number of law enforcement agencies that had low disparities in these things we were looking at. They were jurisdictions in which a police chief had fairly recently taken on the job with a determination to improve the policing delivered in his jurisdiction. They're all he's. In this case, it happens to be. The chief provided strong leadership on we're going to end the disparities in our jurisdiction. The supervisors are going to back me up on this. We're going to give you the best training available, and we expect you to respond accordingly. And Blue Springs is my poster child on this, although some others that are also very good. And over 2 or 3 years, the disparities on consent searches and resisting arrest went way down in Blue Springs. So I take that as proof that they were high before because of something that was corrected by the training that went on. That it was implicit bias, and the leadership of the chief combined with high quality training were enough time. In Blue Springs, black drivers are now half as likely to be put in consent situations as white drivers. They just reversed it. In Blue Springs, very few resisting arrest charges filed. So officers are generally capable. The numbers for black drivers and white drivers are similar. So the officers are able to deal with that effectively.
Is there any, in your data there, did you look at the race, the gender of the officer?
No, that's not recorded. And a lot of people think that's significant. You can ask Chris. But on the other hand, it's not as though whites are the only people with implicit bias. A black officer could just as well think either I need to hold fellow blacks accountable, we need to set a high standard, or could think that, oh, there are a lot of blacks out there that are irresponsible, and I'm going to catch them. So I don't think you can draw a conclusion from that. Maybe there's a bias. We don't have the data, and it could go either way if there were a bias. Other comments on that? I'm an old white guy, and I mistake myself sometimes. I try to do my best.
Let me ask you this.
And that is about the major input of what I was going to say. So we're probably a few questions now, and then maybe more at the end.
Yes, definitely more at the end. So
But while it's fresh in your mind, if a few questions.
Just
Wayne.
respond to this in relation to what you're talking about. There was a lady that she said she was pulled over by a police officer and asked to go ahead and present her license. For some reason, she did not understand why. She happened to have a friend with her, and that woman was white. She was black. And she is sitting there, and she's going, well, what do you need that for? And he says, I've got to see your license, ma'am. Now give me your license. And your registration, too. I need to see your registration. And she said, what do you need that for? And finally, her friend says, well, Marion, is it in the glove compartment? She goes ahead and reaches in the glove compartment. Here it is, Dr. Fuller. Doctor, here it is, Dr. Fuller. And as soon as she says doctor, the officer immediately backed off and said, excuse me, I'll be right back. As soon as he came back from his car, he said, all right, man, you're free to go. Tone changed.
Yeah, well, the tone is one thing, but on the other hand, every officer is going to ask for identification.
Yeah.
Every officer is going to want to see that driver's license. So it's not
as soon as she said doctor, that officer immediately scampered off to his car and then came back and said, you're free to go. Didn't even ask to see anything.
Well, it sounds like an officer that needs some training.
But that's what I'm, okay. The implicit bias.
Yeah.
Was there, as soon as there was doctor, as soon as doctor was entered into the
But he had every right to ask for the license.
He did.
It's surprising that he would let someone go without seeing the license. After all, if it turned out to be someone other than Dr. Fuller, then and she had done something wrong or whatever, then he would have been in big trouble for having done it. Chris is much better at the technicalities.
That's to contact the supervisor so they can look into it. Now, I have no idea what the situation is.
Yeah, I just told them
that could be a case of bias. It could be that they had to be on the lookout out for someone specific, and he realized this is Dr. So-and-so. This is not the person I'm looking for. It's not a doctor.
Might have been it.
Probably not. I don't know. Those are things. And the only other thing I would add, and I think, and Don and I got to know each other over the data, and we got into some great discussions, which is how I ended up here.
Boy, never answered.
Right.
Yeah. We've sent lots of emails back and forth. I always
We got his father involved.
You can look at things categorically, which is looking at numbers, but you also have to look at contextually. You have to look at what makes up. And I'll use the example of the searches that you talked about, the consent searches. Now, I agree that that is a great indicator of potential for bias. I'm not sure that I agree that his his disparity there would be indicative of that. Because, for example, in our jurisdiction, our peer prosecutor, even if you have probable cause, he would rather you get a consent search. So our officers are told, well, even if you have probable cause, ask them for consent. That goes down as a consent search. So that's where, and that's where Don and I agree. There's a need for better data so that we can look at it. Now, that being said, I still agree that that is probably the best indicator, and one of the biggest parts of this that Don sold me on was, you know, I didn't look at that indicator until I met Don, and I started looking at that a whole lot closer. So that was a side note.
Well, this is much more complicated than the summary I was giving. One of the documents that's online is the Missouri Vehicle Stops Report, Consent Searches and Bias-Free Policing. It's 5 pages or so, almost no numbers in it, pretty easy reading. It gives the consent search situation from the point of view of drivers that experience what they would call coercion, and from the point of view of officers who are doing just what they think what they have been taught to do, and they think is a valid police tactic, and then tries to find some common ground between those two. So it gives some pretty good background on what's there. And there's another document that looks at the, it's 30 pages or so, and goes into a lot more detail about the vehicle stop report. So don't say I didn't offer you as much as you wanted. I think one other point I ought to make, though, is that for the data, we're trying to establish patterns. That the overall pattern in the state is for blacks to be affected at a rate X times that of white drivers. And it's important to get to either justify that disparity, oh, it's because of economic factors, or it's because the officers are concentrating their patrols on certain areas, and to be able to explain the disparity as something other than officer bias. But it's also important to even if you've gotten a situation like in Blue Springs, where you see a significant reduction in the disparities in what you consider to be the strongest indicators, that's not all there is to the police work. You could very easily have a situation where there's, say, 1 or 2 officers out there who every once in a while are doing some pretty nasty stuff that involves a specific driver under, you know, whatever circumstances. So even if the patterns show a low disparity, the police departments still need to be very careful that they're hearing all the complaints that come in, and going to being very scrupulous about honoring them as potential indicators of bias, and making sure that the officers are comporting themselves in a way acceptable to the standards of the department. Because without having that 2 sides of it, you could easily have some people suffering some major acts of discrimination. Then back to the just restating, we see the vehicle stops numbers as proving there's a problem out there, but the fact that a place like Blue Springs and when they get a new chief that comes in and follows best practices, sees a significant decline as proof that we can do something about it. The problem tends to be in underfunded departments that don't have the will to make the change, like Ferguson, or big departments that just have the inertia of culture that makes it much harder to change officer behavior. How many officers in St. Joe?
We're authorized 129. We have a total of 172 people in the department.
So that gets up to a pretty big department that's going to take a while to turn around. Lane Roberts, who is now Department of Public Safety Director and was chief in Joplin. And I talked about this the other day, and he said, yeah, he thinks Joplin's going to start showing some better numbers in the near future. Columbia has been very slow, much slower than we would like to change it. It's the police chief doing what appear to be all the right things. So we're impatient, but we sure expect that to turn around. St. Louis, Kansas City, St. Louis County, those places are trying to change, but because they're so big, it's going to take a while. But that's no reason not to insist on the change, or it's certainly a motivation, I think, for supporting the change when the departments are trying to do the right thing while still holding them accountable for the occasional mistakes that officers are doing as they learn how to achieve fair and impartial policing. Well, I always take much longer.
I'll also just note, as you look at numbers, it's interesting to look at it longitudinally over a distance of time, because in some cases you'll see numbers bounce up and down, and they'll bounce back, and you'll see very low disparity one year, a high disparity, and go back and forth. Actually, that may be an indicator that a lot of that policing is based on behavior, and that there is not a consistent pattern. So that's why I say there's just we both learned over the years that it's a lot more complicated than it looks.
Well, and one factor too is that if there's a jump in numbers one year, then the police agency, the department, should be prepared to explain why it occurred. Were you doing something different this year? Well, they should be able to go back and look at and say there were 30 consent searches that year. They should be able to go through it. And for that sort of number, it would be fairly easy to interview each one of those drivers that accepted the consent search and find out what the driver thinks about the experience. Were you treated well by the officer? And if they were, then that's certainly shows something good about the department. But if the drivers are saying, I don't know, that makes it worse than we're doing it, then that's telling you something else.
John, you're up.
Sure. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm going to kind of segue into that as well, talk about the vehicle stops issues that kind of tie into what my presentation is going to be on. So how many people are from the St. Louis area here? Most of you. Okay, most everybody is. How many people have heard of our organization, our city defenders? Okay. So how about 5 years ago? How many people have heard of our organization? Okay. How about a year ago? Okay. A year and a half, year and 2 years. So our organization was started in 2009. Actually, we've been around for 6 years. So we started it right out of law school. I worked at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri in the housing division. My co-founder Thomas Harvey worked at the Public Defender's Office, and another co-founder of mine worked at the Appellate Clinic at SLU Law Clinic. And we were sitting around talking about our experiences, and we realized that there are a couple huge flaws in the way that legal representation is provided to the indigent in St. Louis and throughout the state, actually. The state of Missouri is the second to least funded public defender system in the nation.
Surprise, surprise.
It's Mississippi, then Missouri, per capita. Okay, so it's going through currently a budgetary crisis and caseload crisis, and it has been probably for the last decade. Thomas's job at the Public Defender's Office was basically triaging people out of the programs, out of the services of the public defender. So if you posted a bond of $500 or more, you did not qualify for a public defender, even if it was a family member or cousin or relative that posted that bond. If you made $11,000 a year, you did not qualify for a public defender or above. If you owned a vehicle, you did not qualify for a public defender, even if it was a 1994 Honda Civic that was missing this front hood. You did not qualify for a public defender. His job was triaging people out of the program. I worked at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri, and we had similar funding issues and crisis code issues. And these two organizations that exist to provide legal services to low income did not communicate, did not talk at all, and were serving the same population. And the Public Defender's Office didn't have any social workers on staff anymore. They do now through a small pilot program in the city, but no social workers on staff at all. Legal Services does have social workers on staff, but again, it's very limited programmatic things that they work with, mostly in family law, etc. So we were looking around at, are there other models out there? And we came across an organization called the Bronx Defenders. They do what's called holistic legal defense. And that's basically looking at both the civil and people have when they come in contact with the criminal justice system, when they come in contact with the justice system at all. So we do both the criminal representation and we do civil work as well. We do landlord-tenant work. We help represent people with their disability benefits. We get them connected to services. We try to treat the persons that we represent not as cases, but as people. And we do a lot of things that typical lawyers don't do. In fact, my client services director just yesterday was in an abandoned building trying to get a homeless veteran connected to services and housing, which she successfully did. She was out there at 5 o'clock at night with 2 other attorneys to help her to make sure that she was safe, but to get this guy off the streets and into a program that would help him in his road back into housing and his road back into stability. So we're kind of a unique organization. We're different. We're trying to change a little bit about what people think of when they think of a public defender, what they think of when they think of an attorney. So a lot of what we do is direct representation. In fact, that's initially our core focus, was the focus on to help individuals that are not getting served by the current existing system and are falling through the cracks. Through that work, we have realized that a lot of things are wrong with the system as it exists. Things that in law school you're not taught. You might touch on it briefly, but you're not going to get tested on it, so you don't spend a lot of your time on it. Okay, you don't have much time to begin with. You're just supposed to learn a lot of facts, a lot of case law, and a lot of rules. And it's very hard to think about the policy stuff when you're trying to take a 4-hour exam at the end of the semester. So we decided that we needed to focus more on these policy issues, the things that we saw that were systemic problems within the justice system in St. Louis. And we focused that on doing some research and working on things. And so we started a court watching project because a lot of our cases, and this is another thing, St. Louis, we have a municipal court system, which we all know about, most of you do. It is very unique in the country, very unique in the state in terms of how it operates. And there are no public defenders in that system. Okay? The only chance for you to get appointed attorney in the municipal court is if the prosecutor is seeking jail time, which they usually are not because they're more interested in revenue generation, which we'll talk about. And therefore, they're not saying they're seeking jail time. But the system is set up that a lot of people do spend time in jail because of an inability to pay a fine. And we'll get to that. But there's no public defenders in the municipal courts, and so a lot of our work initially was involved with representing people in those courts. And then we've evolved to understand that what we're doing basically on a day-to-day basis representing individuals isn't enough. What we need is systemic change. And how do you bring about systemic change? Federal litigation. And so we've moved into doing more impact litigation. So what we were doing, for lack of a better word, retail, day-to-day with our clients, we can do wholesale with larger changes in class actions. And so that's what we've been doing in the last year that you've all heard about us. So these are just some information about recent awards and recognitions as we've grown, 6 years, and where we are today. But, this was in April of 2014, Riverfront Times, kind of tongue-in-cheek, wasn't our idea. But the idea of this, public defender is a superhero. Public defender is someone that's actually going to make changes and fight, not just for the individuals, but for society as a whole.
That's you with the red cape, right?
That would not be me. I'd be in the bottom left, I think. I don't know. I mean, the guy who did this was in New York, so I don't think he saw a picture and decided to draw it. One of the problems with this is there's a judge in St. Louis City Municipal Court who unnamed, who looks kind of similar to the judge in this picture. So he's not very happy. They picked the third-party neutral as the villain in the case. But anyway, so this article came out to kind of shone some light on our organization, what we've been doing in the trenches for a number of years prior to it. And then subsequently, just our involvement in the issues related to Ferguson and the municipal before have indicated a lot more. I just can't even read this to fine print. But one of the major articles that kind of summarized, I think, and if you haven't read it already, I would look at the article by Radley Balco in the Washington Post. He came to St. Louis a week after the shooting death of Michael Brown and had read our white paper, which we had released, and then did a larger expose going into the history of the municipalities, how they evolved and formed. And it's a great article, and I'd recommend you reading it. But he had read our white paper, which we had put out and had been working on from that court watching project that we had started over a year and a half ago. That project we got a bunch of lawsuits from WashU and SLU and said, you know, we see a lot of constitutional violations happening in our municipal courts. People were showing up with children, and they were not being allowed into the courtroom because they had kids. And so therefore they would miss their court date and a warrant would be issued for their arrest. We had clients of ours that told us of experiences that they had come into court and said, Your Honor, all I can afford on my fine is $50. That's all I have on me. And the judge say, there's a phone, call everybody you know, and get that $350 for good night, or you're going to jail. Now, that wasn't just one or two things we had heard over the course of years. That was something we heard on a weekly basis. And so there was a lot of abuses that we saw within the municipal court system and that we started to document through the court watching program. This is the tapestry of St. Louis County. Most of you are from there, so you're familiar with it. But there are 91 municipalities currently in St. Louis County and 84 municipal courts. So to put that in perspective, and a little bit here more on municipal courts, but to put that in perspective, the typical judicial circuit in the state of Missouri has roughly 8 municipalities that have their own courts within that circuit. St. Louis County has 84, so nearly 10 times as many municipal courts in circuit court for St. Louis County than there are throughout the United States, or throughout the rest of the state. So you're looking at a presiding judge who's supposed to have supervisory authority over these courts and how they're operating. How can they do that when it's 10 times as many as the typical judge has? They have their own circuit state judges that they have to supervise as well. So you're dealing with a system that historically, and I talked a little bit about this with Chief Connelly, was called a police court system, where it actually wasn't part of the arm of government, the third branch of government. It was actually part of the executive branch of government and the local executive branch, and it was a way of basically maintaining a revenue stream through tickets and fines. It wasn't to the level and the degree and volume that we have now, but it was definitely part of how the system was initially set up and structured, where the judge wasn't actually a judge, the judge was the mayor of the town. Okay. That changed in the 1960s with some reforms in the 1970s, but it didn't change. It didn't really change on practice. Again, this is what we're looking at statistics in 2009, when our organization started. Across the entire state here, roughly $106 million in fines and fees collected by municipalities throughout the state. So over $1 million in fine, court costs, and fee generation that goes toward these municipalities. So about $1 million in 2009, a little over. 2014, okay, 5-year change, they've added an additional roughly $50 million to that in terms of collection. So you have 153 million collected. That's a 29% increase in fines and fees in 5 years. Do we all remember what happened in 2008, 2009? The economy went down. Revenue, property tax values went down. Sales tax, not as many people buying as much, so those go down. As that went down across the state, it's not just St. Louis, but across the state, there was an increase in revenue generation. You can look at all of this. You can look at a lot of the city's budgets, where they would prospectively budget for an increase in revenue and fees, not because they were going to add more or increase the charging amount for a specific violation, which did happen and does happen, not because specifically they were going to add additional fees to things like a warrant recall fee, so you have a warrant, an attorney represents you, gets a warrant recall, but we're going to add an additional $35 onto your bill at the end because of that service of recalling the warrant. Oh, and you might have been unrepresented and you came in and you asked for the warrant to be recalled and you might have gotten it recalled. Well, we're going to send you a letter letting you know that we recalled it, even though you already knew that, and we're going to charge you an additional $15. Those two fees were charged by Ferguson for that period of time from 2009 to 2015. So, municipal courts in Missouri, you're looking at $153.3 million in net. That's throughout the entire state as of 2014. Of that, literally a third is coming from $54.2 million. So the region of St. Louis basically kind of 46% of all fines and fees collected statewide, despite being only home to 22% of Missourians. So you have to wonder that correlation of number of municipalities, number of courts you have within that area, how that relates to what you're seeing in terms of the value, the amount that's being brought in by these towns. So if you look again and you take out the city, if you just look at Missouri's population in the county of St. Louis is only 11% of the state's population. But they brought in 34% of all state fines and fees wide. So you take the city out of the equation and what happens with the municipal courts in the city. And you look just at the 84 municipal courts in the county, that's 34% of all the fines and fees brought in statewide. This is former chief of police for the county, Jim Fitch, who I'm sure is a colleague of yours, from October 17, 2015, St. Louis Magazine. And this is a quote directly from him. He says, "So this is an abuse of police authority. Police do not exist to generate revenue. However, I don't blame the officers. I point the fingers at the elected officials." And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about. So why do you have sort of an increase that might occur with searches, right? Why would you have an increase or a blip that occurs within your vehicle stops that show a disparity? If it looks like, well, if you're going to, perhaps maybe not one of the factors isn't just how, what kind of changes might have occurred based on a top-down within the police department, but what kind of pressure might be the police chief getting from the town, especially when we're talking with small towns, not large towns with yours with many police departments, but when you're talking about only 10 or 12 officers in the police department, or some of our towns in St. Louis County which have 6 or 7 officers, right? So this is statistics that we put in our white paper and that we had generated, and we had been working most of 2014, and we're almost done in the summer, and we were going to release it, and then the events of August 9th happened, shooting death of Michael Brown, and the outrage on the streets, the anger directed toward the town. And we knew we had a part of the puzzle that the media was asking, why is this happening? There had been many deaths of African-American males by police officers. Well, there's been many. There's 28 hours an African-American male is shot by a police officer every 28 hours is statistic. So why now? Why here? Why Ferguson? That was a lot of what the media was asking about. And so we said, well, this isn't the complete answer, but here's part of what's going on. Here's part of why you're having a community that says, no, we don't trust you. We don't trust you telling us that you're going to get to the bottom of this investigation as to what happened to Darren Wilson and Michael Brown. We don't trust you. Why? Because we've been fleeced by this town's court system and by the police department in the town for decades, and we're not going to take that. We're not going to trust that anymore. We're going out in the streets, and that was something that our clients have been telling us for years, that there's a problem here, and we knew that there was a problem here, but we, frankly, at first didn't believe them. Didn't believe our own clients in terms of what they were telling us. And we had to do the statistics and do the research and figure this out and realize what was happening. Yeah.
That works out to, one stop for every 2 people in the area.
Yeah, I'll go into, yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering, is that how it's dispersed, or is it concentrated?
So
People getting multiple stops.
the problem is nobody lives just in Ferguson, right? If you look at the shape of Ferguson, it's actually sort of a C. You go through Delwood, to get through in the middle of it, you can cross through Delwood. Cool Valley is right there. I mean, the problem is it isn't just Ferguson, we'll get to that. It's statistics throughout the entire county. Okay. So when you look at this, you'll look at the population, you say, well, not everybody that's getting pulled over is from Ferguson. Well, yeah, but they live in little towns having the same issue. They're doing the same thing. Okay. So again, Ferguson, a city about 21,000, 11,000 traffic cases. This is a comparison. We're looking at Chesterfield, a large white city in the western suburb, almost the exact same number in its cases filed, but its population is twice that of Ferguson's. But you're going to see a very different change in terms of the racial dynamic that you have in Chesterfield versus Ferguson. Again, I kind of compared Ferguson and Chesterfield here a little bit here, but Ferguson in the fiscal year 2013 filed more than 12,300 non-traffic cases, more than any other city in the county. That was up by 8,000 cases from over 2009. So it wasn't just traffic cases. So when we talk about the interaction between justice and race, it's not just traffic. It's not just the traffic reports and traffic stops that we have to look at. We have to think about other things that happen within the municipal court system as well. Chesterfield, however, in terms of the non-traffic violations, only filed about 2,000 cases, 2,300 cases. So those are the smaller things, like the petty theft cases. Those are the failure to comply with an officer cases, resisting arrest, property-related cases, not having a trash can lid secured properly. I don't know if you read the article in the Post-Dispatch a couple months ago. 2013, the municipal court in Ferguson, city again of 21,000 people, issued 32,000 arrest warrants for nonviolent offenses. That's 90.2 arrest warrants issued per day. Despite Ferguson's relative poverty, fines and court fees combined the second largest revenue source in the city in 2013. That has changed dramatically. Right now, the statistics that are being reported is roughly a 40% drop in terms of the number of tickets being issued and violations occurring that are being charged up in the municipal court system in Ferguson. So there's been a substantial drop. But again, a 40% change from 2010, raising their income from court fines and fees to over $2.6 million. This is from Professor at George Mason University, again, in probably about just the middle of September of 2014. Again, this is not your most liberal university, not one of your most liberal professors, George Mason University, but again, it talks about what we're seeing here is revenue generation, taxation of citizenry through a municipal court system structure. And how do those cases start? They start with the interaction between the police officer and the citizen. And Ferguson is an outlier, okay? This is a statistic from the New York Times, but warrants issued for 1,000 residents. You can see Ferguson here is an outlier. This is a visual of the answer as to why Ferguson, why did this happen at Ferguson? The statistics are fairly high. Things have changed dramatically since this. These are statistics from 2014, but you still see sort of a breakdown here. And I'm not sure where St. Joe would be on that. Chief Connelly, I'm not sure if you can see it at all, but it's probably closer down to this area.
Yeah, we're fairly
right.
Certainly don't have 90 warrants today. I'd be pulling my hair out. I already am, but that's what we have.
Right. So the question then, hands up, don't shoot, right? Again, this goes to statistics that have been pulled from the same report from the Attorney General's office, the vehicle stop disparity index report. This is Ferguson's population as it exists in 2014, 67% African American, 29% white. But in terms of percentage of traffic stops, Ferguson comprised 86% of all traffic stops were African Americans in Ferguson. Just 12.1% were whites. In Ferguson, 92.7% of the individuals arrested in Ferguson were African American, only 6.9%. Throughout all this, you see the statistic leans heavily against African Americans in terms of the number that you see here. The only time it flips is when you hit the contraband rate. Whites are more likely than African Americans to have any contraband, 34.4% versus 21.71%. This is a statistic that's statewide. It's in the vehicle report. You can see the state statistic. It's almost exactly mirrors Ferguson's here. So you have to see that that leads to what are we talking about in terms of implicit bias. When search is conducted, when a stop is made, is there going to be contraband, even though there might be the suspicion of contraband, or maybe even believe that there's probable cause. It reaches that level that there's probable cause that there's contraband. The statistics play out that an African American is less likely going to have that than a white individual. So again, this is just a little bit of statistics here on this. Again, the focus had been on Ferguson. The focus was on the disparities and the events that we saw in Ferguson and what was happening in Ferguson. But, and I've tried to bring this up a little bit, it's not just Ferguson. Look at St. Louis County as a whole. You'll see this throughout the jurisdictions in St. Louis County. In terms of just size of revenue, St. Anne was the largest town to rely on its municipal court revenue. So it's roughly $3.3 million was brought in through its court fines and fees. It's quite high, but as a percentage of its full revenue, it's below that 30% cap that used to be required.
Is St. Anne bigger than Ferguson?
St. Anne's population is smaller than Ferguson. However, it does have I-70 and 170 go through it. And then you also have more.
A document.
Yes.
A problem of sending people away.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Shopping in that area.
There used to be the mall that was there, and as the mall closed, things changed. So, and I think I'll compare in this St. Anne and De Pere, which looks a little bit here. So again, if we look at
the other hand, St. Anne has a new police chief who wants to take it over.
Sure, no, he does, and he's addressed and looked at this disparity index as part of what he's trying to push in terms of reforms, and he knows about that. some of what's happened in the reform efforts that have come out of all of this is people have heard of Senate Bill 5 and how that is changing some of the requirements placed on municipalities. I think, St. Anne's police force is probably going to be one of the ones that'll stay by themselves and not have to merge with another force to stay accredited because of the size. But Jimenez is pushing for reforms there. So St. Anne is making some attempts to change the wall on this. But St. Anne is also a town that had, a speed trap set up where they would have a guy in the hotel room with his speed gun picking people up. And then cops along the way, and they'd radio where the guys were and pick them up. So it was about, they had funding to reduce what was traffic accidents that were occurring on the stretch of the highway, and that's what they utilized the funds for. Okay.
May I say something?
Yes.
I have some examples where the Latino community close by St. Anne, and I have the cases that women are pulled over by the police, and they arrested. And they even put in the jail, and they have to pay $100 for let them know where the car is, and plus the bond that is, I guess, $325. So they have to pay for attorney. So for us as a Latino community, we are not allowed to close by and
No, I've heard that.
It's going to be funny, but it's not.
I know. No, I've heard that. Communities of people that I represent, they will not go to St. Anne. If you tell them you have to cross, they will go around.
We have the issue where when we are undocumented, they come over and they go to deportation centers, and they be a part of the family right away because of the traffic.
Right. So St. Anne's jail holds individuals for other towns that don't have enough funding to have their own jail. St. Anne also receives federal dollars to hold federal prisoners in their jail. And so they have a strong relationship with the federal government. ICE is there as well, and they refer individuals that don't have proper documentation to ICE more readily than you would see in another town. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask, you talk about St. Anne shooting radar from hotel rooms. I guess something 3 weeks ago, I was administrating, and I think it was cool. Kind of like off the road, and they were shooting radar up at the highway. I just wanted to know, are these type of tactics, are they kind of like illegal in any form or fashion?
It is not illegal. Well, they're not illegal. I mean, they can use the radar gun to monitor the traffic and speed of flow of individuals on the highway. They have that authority because of the fact that there was a higher accident rate that was occurring in different areas. It's just like a DUI stop, like when they set up a checkpoint, and Connelly can tell you more about the grounds that you need to have to be able to establish a DUI checkpoint. But there are requirements that need to be in place for what would be, you would think, out of the ordinary measures in terms of the stop or the traffic enforcement. Cool Valley, I believe, actually does not have a police force anymore. They disbanded a few years ago. Might have been another town. But again, to kind of just go back a little bit to this presentation, there's a little bit here. You can see the statistics versus revenue and how that relates to a disparity index that you might see. And again, it changes because of the population of the town and the demographics of the town. One town that, just in terms of behavior to look at, is Bell Ridge. Again, they projected an increase in revenue of roughly $385,000, or $65,000 increase in revenue in the court fines and fees, which ultimately resulted in like a $450 tax on its citizens if you assume the majority of the people that go into courts are going to be residents of Bell Ridge. Again, 1,000 households in Bell Ridge, but just roughly 22,800 residents, 83% African American, of which 42% were below the poverty level. And so you have a community that lives in Bell Ridge that does not feel that the police force is accurately reflecting the needs of the community. And that is indicative throughout some of the areas that we're talking about here. Here's just sort of a breakdown. I look at some of the disparity index statistics as well in some of this, but population size of these different towns, it's only 574 people, and they have a police force of 14, right? And they also provide services to build the Village Hills. It's less than a square mile, the town is. But yet it raised over $221,000 in court fines, fees, and costs in 2014. Yeah.
Now this just didn't happen yesterday. This
No.
has been accumulating. Why do we as citizens of the state of Missouri put up with this?
Well, the question is, what do you mean?
I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I understand they don't have the funding because there's not the tax base, and they don't want to increase any taxes. But to expect a judge to handle all that mess, knowing that he's going to be paid if he says you got to pay this, you got to. This sounds just absolutely horrendous to me.
Yes, there's a lot of issues. The question is, a lot of people, when I was being interviewed back in September of 2014 about the system and how it exists, and like, how come people just are finding out about this? My response is, well, it depends on what you mean by when you say people. Because there are a lot of people that have known about this problem for a long time and have been talking about it, but their voices just weren't being heard, weren't being listened to. And I come up with my privilege as a lawyer and a white young male. This is a panel on race and justice, and we're all white men. I come up with in front of a media news crew, and I talk about it, and people start to listen, right? So if we want to talk about race and justice, we should talk about it not just what happens in our legal system, but how it is perceived within our media, how it's perceived throughout our region, how we talk about it through our politics. A lot of this is tied into issues related to education, to funding of the school districts. It's connected to everything. Okay, and so the question is, why are we putting up with this? Well,
It's not only they're not black, they're the poor rednecks. That it just is a perpetual.
Right. There is classism involved with it as well. So poverty is huge.
We didn't have that many people down there to make the numbers that big.
Right.
We have 5 more minutes. And
sure.
Definitely. We can do questions at the end. So we have about half an hour.
Sure. I'm just going to point to one thing here. We talk about sort of the systemic problems that we see and how they need to be addressed. And some police departments are taking proactive steps to do that in St. Joseph's and other communities. This is a town, Edmondson, right near the airport. Again, 834 people live in this town. It's roughly just under 50% African American. The police force is just 9 officers. But they raised, let's go back. Beverly Hills with 14 officers and 474 people raised $221,000. Edmondson raised $568,000 in court fines and fees. This was a letter from the mayor to the chief of police of Edmondson and all of the sergeants from April of 2014. And this is the part I'd like to highlight. I wish to take this opportunity to remind you that the tickets that you write do add to the revenue on which the police department budget is established and will directly affect the pay adjustments at budget time. So this is an endemic problem. It's a systemic problem. The pressure is coming from, the police department doesn't function in a vacuum. And so there is pressure coming from the administrative agencies of those towns. And you see it with Chief of Police Fitch in the county talking about, who does he blame? Is it the police officers' fault that this is occurring? No, the pressure is being put on based on the community that they're working within. And unfortunately, you see this happening, and you see officers that have expressed their dissatisfaction in this area of the county, in St. Louis. And there needs to be wholesale change here, because what we have is a lot of conflict. The towns are dependent upon the revenue from the municipal courts, fines and fees. They're dependent upon it because there isn't sales tax base or property tax base to support the town. But they're exploiting and they're targeting minorities in the community, and they're exploiting them because of their poverty, because they're not able to hire a lawyer to advocate for them. They're not able to see the larger systemic problems and point it out and make a policy argument for it. And so what you see is a larger systemic problem, of which the criminal justice system, the municipal court system that we have in the county is just a single part of that. Okay. So I appreciate the time, and I'll wrap up, and then I'll hand it over to Chief Connelly.
We'll do questions at the end. I promise we'll have the
That was very good. Now let me start by saying the PowerPoint I have were actually notes I put together. I just happened to do my notes on a PowerPoint, and then I was talking to him today, and I said, well, shoot, I'll just throw that PowerPoint up there and I'll work off it. I'm not going to go, I'll touch on it. To premise this a little bit, number one is we don't survive off our traffic ticket revenue. We would probably cut our department by probably 80% if we did. We're probably not one of the highest ticket issuers. I feel that traffic enforcement is extremely important in our community. And we have more injuries from traffic enforcement than we do from the 10 to 12,000 crimes that are committed every year. However, I believe in traffic for enforcement in the high hazard intersections, the places where we're having the hazards. And if that means less tickets, that's okay with me, because what's our goal? Our goal is to reduce injuries, reduce traffic accidents, reduce the cost. You've got to do the right things for the right reason. I'm even going to defend our municipal court system, which I'm not a fan of. But our judge, he's been the judge the whole time I've been there, which is almost 10 years. And he's basically run on a platform of compassion for those that can't afford to pay. And then some of these things, he's always been very good, and I have to give him credit for looking at people in their situation. That being said, they still issue way too many warrants. It drives me crazy. And there are different systems. As mentioned, I spent most of my career in Portsmouth, Virginia. Portsmouth is, I don't know, roughly 55% African-American, community of about 100,000. Usually the highest crime city in the state of Missouri. And you know, they're not supposed to compare crime for ranking, but sometimes we're in the top 15 in the nation.
Missouri, you mean Virginia.
Virginia, yes, thank you. I've been in St. Joseph. St. Joseph, completely different demographic. In St. Joseph, it's about 88 point something percent white. It's about 6% African American and about 5% Hispanic. Now, I will tell you that we do have a disparity index when it comes to African American drivers. And I look at those very closely, and it's important that you do ask those questions. And I look at a variety of things to see what's happening. Now, let's say you and I are both 18 years old, okay? And we've got to get car insurance. Who's going to pay more for the car insurance? Me. Why?
Because you're male.
Why?
Because males typically tend to be more risk takers. and so on.
Exactly. Most people will just say because you're male. But the truth is, it's because a lot of us 18-year-old guys, I wish I was 18, a lot of us, we engage in higher risk behavior. Exactly. So one of the things I look at, okay, and if you look at the demographics of a city, and you look at, if you study criminology, you'll see that a lot of the street crimes are most prevalent in our lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. Why? Well, a lot of times, because they're disorganized neighborhoods, engage in higher risk behavior. Now, we also have a higher concentration of minorities. So when I go and I look and I see, okay, what are the suspects in the crimes being reported to us? And if I see, and in some cases I've seen where African Americans are way overrepresented in those suspects. Why? It has nothing to do with being African American. It has the same thing to do with the behavior of the white suspects. And that's what we've got to get out there. It's so quick for people to jump to assumptions, including Hollywood, when it comes to things like that. So you got to generate those questions. You got to look. Let's see what's happening. That's why I say look at things contextually. What makes that up? And in some cases, some of it's going to be implicit bias. Did everyone check their bias in at the door? We'd like to think that. We'd all like to think that. Said I actually grew up in New Jersey. I like soccer. I have a couple of kids. One's in college. The other one's 12. The reason I tell you this, I serve on multiple nonprofit boards, have on different ones, and currently do, which is why I love this. I love what's taking place here. Why do I tell you this? Now you're seeing me as a person. Because most of the time when I go into a group, they see me as a police officer. Anyone ever have that feeling that you're being judged because of how you look? Or maybe by your blue uniform? I remember early on when I was a young man and single, and I'd go out and be in this college area, and see this pretty young lady, and she'd ask what I do. Oh, I work for the city. Well, what do you do? Oh, I work in sanitation. I collect garbage. Oh, the one gal grabs my hand, and this was in the early '80s when we weren't real popular then either. She feels my hand and she goes, "Those aren't calluses there." I told her what I did. She didn't really want much to do with me anymore, but you know, I actually used to experience that quite a bit. Now, anybody in here think that we police department, maybe we have an image problem in this country right now?
Yeah.
You know, I'm glad somebody brought that up. Okay. When I speak to groups, policing is largely defined by two entities, and they're very closely related. One is 3 24-hour news channels that are competing for money. Half of what they have on is editorializing, and they love to grab onto a police story and play it over and over and over and over, which is okay. But I mean, they are making money off it. The media is making big money off it. Now, the other big entity, primetime TV. What is on during primetime TV every night?
NCI, yes.
Some type of law enforcement police show, right? And what are they showing? They're showing us chasing people down in cars, shooting people up. You know, sadly, they're mostly showing us chasing African American males down. On a lot of those, in my city, we mostly chase down white guys. We're largely being defined by that, but you know what we do more than anything else? In our mission statement for the St. Joseph Police Department is based around protection, service, and partnership. Protection and service and partnership with the community. That word in the middle is in the middle for a reason, service. That's the biggest part of what we do. We provide service, we deliver service. We spend most of our time providing service. We are very closely related to an awful lot of our folks in the social services field. Our folks on any given night, at least 2 to 3 times, oftentimes more, we respond to people in crisis that are either threatening suicide, have attempted suicide. We're dealing with children that are abused. At night when there's no other services available to come out, at least in an area like ours, whose problem is that homeless family? It's a police problem. When nobody wants to fund something, it becomes a police problem. So, you know, that's some of the things that people don't consider. So professional policing, and let me see here, make sure I get that, oops, wrong one. Okay, mindset policing. How do we change the mindset in policing and in the community? And the reason I put in the community is because we do all have biases. There's biases towards us, and most of these are implicit biases. A good friend of mine, Chip Heath, he works for Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. He and a guy by the name of Jack Caldwell, who's retired, wrote a book called The Power of Unconditional Respect. And Chip goes around and talks a lot about mindset policing. And you know, to me, that title says it all right there.
Yes.
Power of unconditional. You know, unleashing the power of unconditional respect is actually. But think about how powerful that is. And mindset. Think about how important it is. Somebody brought up about how a person was stopped and they're asking for a driver's license, and she didn't know why she was stopped. How hard is it for me to say, "Excuse me, sir, the reason I stopped you is because you were doing 35 in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. Can I please see your driver's license and registration?" You now know why. You now know why I've asked them. You know, Chip tells a story about he was in a group that was it was part of their tactical team, but it was also a street crime group, very high impact group. And he talks about how changing mindset, sometimes explaining what you've done, sometimes explaining even after you've had to fight somebody and hurt them what you did and why, can go an awfully long ways. It all comes back to seeing people as people, and that's why I told you a little bit more about myself. Because if you see me as a person, and I see you contextually as a human being and value that, it changes our interaction. So, what does it take? How do we change mindset policing? You know, our organization is built, as I said, a commitment to protection, service, partnership in the community. You know, these are, like I said, these were notes. We remain committed to promoting fair and impartial. Of course, we have a policy against bias-based policing. You won't hear me talk about racial profiling because I think that's an antiquated term for one thing. It's about bias, because no bias is acceptable. Doesn't matter. You know, when I first came to the city of St. Joseph, they had a pork processing plant move in, and there was, I referred to it as kind of a Hispanophobia going on. We had Hispanic immigrants coming here, and people were upset, they were scared. I've been there about 4 months, and my mom and stepdad are coming to visit. Well, they're going to stay at the Holiday Inn downtown. My stepdad likes to get up and go for a walk at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I've gotten calls, people asking me concerns about crime and this, that, and the other thing. Well, my mom and stepdad, they run a realty company called Macias Realty. It's a bilingual realty company because my stepdad is Hispanic. His family's from Mexico. He's the first full generation in the United States. So I thought, my gosh, these people are going to see my stepdad. They're going to call the police. These guys that I haven't worked with much are going to stop my stone. Well, none of that happened. So that was a good thing. But this was almost 10 years ago, and some of my friends who were Hispanic, they kind of felt it. My wife felt it some. My wife came from another country, and she's Arabic, but a lot of people would mistake that for Hispanic. Now, fortunately, I've seen our community really improve during this time period. It's amazing. Very proud of that. When it comes to bias-based policing, it's important that people hear it from the top. The state requires training on the topic of bias-based policing. Well, they say racial profiling, and they require 3 hours over a 3-year period. We go ahead and train every year, partly because if you're going to combat implicit bias, you have to keep it on the front of your mind. You have to you've got to make sure people are conscious that these implicit biases exist in all of us. When I first came to the city, family hadn't even gotten there. I'm riding along with some officers. Sometimes you challenge your assumptions, and I'm used to policing in a different city. So we go down to this club, and it's like Club 50. Kind of hear this hip hop music, and music that in the community that I worked for 20 years in would typically be an African American crowd, and I'm very comfortable walking in there. And all of a sudden, I see all these white folks, and the hair stood up on my back. Anyone, that sounds strange, doesn't it? Well, my experience in the city of Portsmouth was, in some of the white clubs, if you weren't careful, you would get sucker punched if you're a white officer. In the black clubs, you didn't have to worry about that. So I didn't even consciously think about that till I noticed how uncomfortable I was. And that's an implicit bias right there. That's, you don't even know that you have it, and then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, that kind of shocked me. Maybe step back, maybe think about it a little bit. And when you think about things like that, then you start to look at things contextually, and you can start to get past it. We talked about, building a culture around the power of unconditional respect. That's something that we preach. It has to be heard from the top. But it takes more than that. That's just one approach. You have to reinforce these values in a number of different ways. Every one of our officers is trained in mental health first aid. Mental health first aid, it's a big issue out there. It's huge. It's underfunded. We deal with it day in, day out. It's important that we. And what does that talk about? It talks about, some of the same types we want to promote. Listen unconditionally. Not to pass non-judgmentally, empathy, understanding. Those same principles that we want to combat bias. So you've got to take it from a bunch of different approaches. Ethics. Ethics training, I love ethics. I could change this whole thing and go on ethics. But I do the ethics training for my department. In fact, 2 weeks ago, every person in my department has been through an hour of ethics with me. And I love it. It's important. But ethics is huge. And actually, I have a bunch of slides on ethics we probably won't get to. But ethics, being solid in your values and your ethics, is what guides that discretionary behavior. And to me, hearing, I'm in a large enough department, yet small enough department, that they can hear it from the chief. And they can see that I'm committed to this. This is what is expected of them, and they hear it directly from me. I talk about a couple different kinds of ethics. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher around the 1700s. And one of the things that he wrote about in one of his books was it's as important how you accomplish something as what you accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that is what our system of justice, because it's important that procedural justice, we don't want to violate someone's rights, right? So it's important how we do it and what we're trying to do. Niccolo Machiavelli, book The Prince, some of you may have read it or be familiar with it. He was kind of known for writing about the ends justifies the means. So I take that approach. It doesn't matter if I run all over your Fourth Amendment rights, as long as I make that's not acceptable. So now I'm going to give you an ethics test. It's a continuum. Some people fall a little more Kantian. Some people fall a little more Machiavellian. Into a Walmart, and you go to buy a pair of jeans, and the clerk undercharges you by $10. What are you going to do? You're going to tell them. That's very Kantian, because it's important how you got your jeans. Now, if I'm going to look at this from a Machiavellian standpoint, I may try to rationalize my behavior by saying, Walmart, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, are they going to miss a set of jeans? And you know what? This clerk, they shouldn't have made a mistake. So what if they take it out of his or her paycheck? That would be those are extremes. But to me, it's important to stress these things. Make sure people understand. Go over ethical dilemmas with your people. Have them process this ahead of time before they're confronted with it. That way they can make good decisions. The other thing, a big thing, is accountability. Professional standards, policy compliance. Policy compliance deals with accreditation. We have policy manuals this big. We say we're doing this. If we don't have a policy compliance person in there, we aren't going to make sure we do what we say we do. Professional standards goes way beyond internal affairs. If you think someone's done something wrong, call. Let us investigate it. That's what professional agencies do. But professional standards also tracks every use of force. Now, when we talk about use of force, someone pulls out their gun, that's a use of force. And someone putting their hands, if I even pull that way and you have to pull back, that's a use of force. We track all of those things. Reviewed by our supervisor, reviewed by the patrol commander, reviewed by professional standards, and reviewed by a training officer. Training officer to see if there's some training issues. She tracks things, everything from absences to complaints to everything, and we have what's called an early warning system. So if we see somebody that they're having problems at home that's contributing to it, or maybe something more serious, we try to identify that in advance.
About 10 more minutes.
Okay. Track use of force, recruitment efforts need to meet or exceed demographics. Some of the times when we look at our group, we're 5% Hispanic, our department's about 5% Hispanic. We're 6% African American, our department's 5%. But most of the African Americans don't see that because some of them are senior and they're on the same shift. And no, we do not make assignments based on race. So we really need to exceed that demographic in order for it really to feel the representation on that delivery end. And since we want to make time for questions, the other big thing is, we've been real successful in a number of ways. I don't claim to say that we do everything right. We've got human beings. We do a lot of big things really well, and we have some, and we have a lot of people that really get it, and we have some people that don't. During all these last 2 years, 2 years ago, we passed a public safety tax. We had the support in our community to bring that forward, to add officers, to improve our department. We've had that support from the community, and that doesn't come easy. We have a long-term strategic plan, which we're updating. In our planning process, we include the community. We just finished up, we have one more, 8 out of our 9 focus groups. And these focus groups, we bring them together. We get it from businesses. We get it from the nonprofit community. We get it from citizen groups. We got it from the NAACP. So we get this cross-section to help identify where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are, where the opportunities are and where our constraints are, and we have them help us prioritize that. You know, we had the YWCA hosted a breakfast against racism, and they kept asking me to show up to that breakfast, and they said, you know, we'd like you to make sure you're there, and we want you just to comment, you know, just go up there and say, you know, show your commitment for the police department regarding combating racism. And I was like, okay, I'll be there. Come here like 2 more times. You are going to be there. We expect you to speak. I'm like, yeah, I'll be there. So I'm sitting there, and they called me up, and I'm very proud of this, but they gave us an award for leadership. And I was like, you know what? I was speechless. Not, as you can tell, I can talk. So not too often I'm speechless. Something I'm very proud of. Now, that's not because we're perfect, but it's because we're engaging the community. We're transparent about what's going on. We're transparent and always have been about our racial profiling figures. And it's not something that we started doing a year and a half ago when Ferguson happened. It's something that we have a track record of doing for many years. So I can leave time for questions for all of us. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have a question. It seemed to me over the last maybe 8 years or 10 years that there went to this militarization process where you'll see officers were literally, because of YouTube, you see all this now, where you'll see maybe 6, 7, 8 officers that will all shoot at one person that's not actually moving at that moment. And I started to think, because I'm ex-military, but I was thinking, okay, I see this trend, so is this a training that's happening that allow, because I see this process happen.
Without specifically seeing the video, but what I will tell you is one thing that we do train against is we train against sympathetic fire. And I'm sure you know, sympathetic fire means that, you know, we're, the 3 of us have you or all there, and someone hears a gunshot and they shoot. And so that's something we train very hard on, particularly, and it becomes particularly important if you're deploying any type of less lethal. And we have a very strict protocol that you announce before you deploy less lethal to make sure that somebody, you know, that doesn't. And you actually have to train to make sure that people do that. That may be the situation you're talking about. I'm not sure, but that's something that yes, ma'am.
I would think with the gun culture that we have in this country and in this state, if I were a policeman, I'm afraid I would tend to think that every car I stop, every person I address, whether it be someone, an old white lady like me, has a gun. Now, do you think that maybe that fear has infiltrated a lot of those officers' minds?
What we do is we train people to be hypervigilant. You have to be hypervigilant about that. But at the same time, we also have to train them that, you know, you have to be observe. You have to observe. You have to be careful, because there are a lot of people out there that want to hurt you, and a lot of us have been hurt numerous times. And if you've been in as long as I have, I can't tell you how many times I've been assaulted for various reasons. Sometimes, however, you can be professional when you do it. You can be alert. You can do it. And if you're structured and you're professional, your communication will be professional, and that's important. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I live in the Normandy area in St. Louis, and earlier the PowerPoint has several of the municipalities that's in the Normandy area. I attended a meeting at Pageville City Hall. Can you give me an idea of what is unaccredited police officer versus accredited?
Okay, accreditation is a process for a department, and there's the national accreditation and there's now the state certification. National accreditation is fairly expensive, but no matter what, it's an important process in that some of that policy compliance person, the auditing that they do, it makes sure that you have solid policy and procedure that is up to date, that is consistent with best practices. It includes usually getting feedback from the community about your department. So it's really a professional. It's like you have hospitals accredited, and the push is we want more and more departments accredited. We were nationally accredited, reached the highest level of accreditation. The program got cut funding when we laid off officers back in 2009. Now we're in the state certification program, but while the program got cut, we never went away from those principles. We continued to do audits. We contacted other departments to do cross audits, and when we did our audits, we contacted people from whether it be the prosecutor's office, different other entities to participate in those audits, those professional practices. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that you work with persons who have teaching your officers with disabilities.
Oh, absolutely. That's huge. And we have
what about persons who have, take for example, I myself have epilepsy. Seizures are not completely controlled, and years ago, over 30-some years ago, I was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky for being drunk. But I was not, I was toxic on medication, and had just come out of having a seizure. And was formerly president of the Epilepsy Foundation of America.
Yep, and we do that, and right now, we're working with Merrill. It came through one of our focus groups, and we're going to do some additional work with Merrill regarding the deaf community. Because we're, she said, there's ways we can improve on that. Yes, ma'am.
Who sets the
Two more questions.
Who sets the standards for your training for dealing with the mentally ill and your hours on ethics? Who sets those standards for the police department?
The post commission sets standards. I don't even know if they have a standard on ethics. We exceed a lot of those standards, and not every department has that level of mental health training. They have some basic standards in the academy, and then they have some standards for maintaining and continuing your license. And what we do is we go and look for best practices, and that's why it's important to look at your police department, to go to the meetings, to ask questions, things like the Citizens Academy, participate in things like the Citizens Academy, so that you know that we're your police department. We work for you. So ask the questions, come down and find out, because we're there to serve you. And every now and then, if one of our colleagues or one of our employees forgets that, we want to remind them. Yes, ma'am, I think you're the last question.
I was basically going to say, as a simple question, who sets these standards? Because you said something about 3 years of non-bias-based policing training.
Glad you brought that up. That's the post, and the one slide I didn't get to was actually our next step is cultural proficiency training. And the most important thing, and I'm really glad you brought it up, and I'll be real quick. Cultural proficiency training. Some of you know Dave. I bet someone here that knows Dave Howery. He's worked in a lot of nonprofits. He's now the executive director of our InterServe. And he invited me to a cultural proficiency training, and it was hosted by our diversity committee in town. And I attended. It was awesome. So I talked to the guy. We're actually negotiating price, and his team comes in. And the neat thing is we had people from all over. We had different countries, different races, different backgrounds. And right now, what I'm negotiating with him and Northwest Missouri's public safety, when I told their chief about throwing some money that direction, he wants his folks into it, is to do the training with the community. Because we all have our biases. If I do that cultural proficiency training and issues together, this is an exercise we did, cultural perception. If we do this together, we see people as people. We learn from each other. We have that courageous conversation to where we're not necessarily offended because I called you black or African American or wasn't sure. And we learn from each other. One of the exercises we do is you take someone you don't know in there, and the first thing you do is you write down that person's family origin, languages spoken in their home. What language do you think are spoken in my home?
English and Spanish.
Excellent. English, Arabic, and French. But a person who doesn't might not get that. You got favorite foods, types of movies. Yeah, that's always why they're like, oh, you like cotton? No, I don't like cotton. That's the last thing I want to see. I'm sorry. It's kind of like a friend of mine. He's a neurosurgeon. He can't say, he sees the medical part of things, and he's like, that's not right. Types of music. I go pick up my son from swimming and talk about music, and Really? You listen to music? Yeah, I'm the chief of police, doesn't mean I'm not a human being. I like food too, I'm a Italian food. So the exercise that just kind of opens your eyes, because what it shows you is you make all these, these are the assumptions you made based on how somebody looks. And then you find out the reality. And then you tell them what the truth is about you, and it's like, wow. And
You make it stand.
yeah, I was in a meeting once where I was almost infuriated because somebody made an assumption. They said, well, I don't know what you're saying because your kids grew up in a parents. And they've always had that support. I turned red. I'm going to be polite about this. And I said, with all due respect, you don't know me. You don't know about my background. You don't know that I was a single parent and had custody of my oldest child since he was 2 and was a single parent for 6 or 7 years with him. I was renting out a room to make sure ends meet. I was working all different shifts trying to find childcare, and I had no family in the area. I said, so, and he has a disability. I said, so careful what you decide just because you see me, 20 years later in a police chief's uniform.
Yeah.
So that's I guess that's my
Let's thank
soapbox.
everybody on the panel. I know that they'll stay around for just a couple minutes, so if anybody has any specific questions, I'm sure they will happily answer them for a minute or two before we end. But I do want to let you all have your break before we go to the banquet. If you could turn in your evaluation forms, I'll give you
Just one last thing about what Empower Missouri is doing, that the question about raising standards, that if we're going to have higher standards for police, it has to be because community members are putting the pressure on elected officials to make it happen. Empower Missouri will help you do that. We look at the data to come up with the best judgment of what's wrong and what would fix it. We work with, we're members of the Don't Shoot Coalition in St. Louis, so we're